Bluegrass Airport is an American aviation story. Its remarkable history has been chronicled through a series of oral history interviews. We're speaking with Mary Jo Maloney, a licensed pilot and daughter of Dr. George Gumbert. Mary Jo quite literally grew up on the private aviation side and behind the scenes of Bluegrass Airport. Mary Jo, do you remember hearing stories about the airstrips prior to development of Bluegrass Field?
The airstrips that I recall the discussions about would be Cool Meadow, which is where present-day Fasig-Tipton is located out on Newtown Pike, and then Halley Field in the Meadowthorpe area. Yes, heard stories, heard about Lindbergh landing, I believe at Halley, maybe Cool Meadow, but Dad often will tell stories about that, and he does have quite a bit of memorabilia about both of those airports in his possession.
What are some of your father's favorite stories related to Bluegrass Field?
If Dad had to tell some favorite stories about Bluegrass Field, I expect they would include some of the more famous aircraft that have landed here, some of the famous people that may have come through Bluegrass Field, and probably just the basic evolution of the field, which he really saw from the old terminal on up through the present day.
What are some specifics about those aircraft and celebrities?
Dad to this day has a set of pictures in his house of about 5 different historically significant aircraft as they landed, that professional photographs of them touching down on runway 422 out there. Specifically, it would be the Queen's plane, the Royal Air Force jet. After that, it would be the Concorde, which was big fun. And of course, the Sheikh 747 was quite the buzz back then. And then I remember another one, perhaps the Blue Angels, because we used to have some fun air shows here, and they did some pretty amazing stuff out there. So those would be if I had to grab a bunch of aircraft that I remember off the top of my head, that would be them.
Any people that your father likes to reminisce about?
As far as people that he would talk about, celebrities, clearly the Queen. It's not every day you get to meet the Queen, and she's been here more than once, and he was fortunate enough to be able to greet her. And you know, there've been a variety of stars, either coming in for UK games or the races or whatever, but if I had to pick one, it'd be the Queen, I'm sure.
Mary Jo, do you have any favorite stories about the airport?
I have to say that if I recalled stories or memories of my own here at Bluegrass Field, I have to start by saying that I'm kind of an airport brat. A lot of kids grow up at a lake house or whatever kind of a retreat. This was our family's retreat. We were out here in the evenings, in the summertime, half the time. This is where I learned to fly and got my pilot's license, so it's very special to me because of that. The folks at Aerotech taught me how to fly. And growing up, this seems so hokey, kind of small townish, but in fact, we were a small town back then. We would come as a family out here, and we would stop on the way out of town at the Starlight Drive-In on Stone Road and get fried chicken boxes and come out and have a picnic at the tea hangars, my brother, my mother, my dad, and me, while Dad worked on the planes, or we'd just watch what we call the traffic. Watch the traffic to see who's landing and taking off, identify the airplanes. So it was really more of a process growing up out here.
Were there other families doing the same thing?
I have to say there weren't too many other families that hung out at the airport like the Gumberts did. There were a few. I think David Trapp, he'd be in and out a little bit. Dr. Stevens would bring the kids out. But if I recall, my brother and I were pretty much the only two out here that were really young.
Did the growth of the airport seem gradual, Or was there ever a, wow, this has changed moment?
If I had to describe a wow moment or a moment when the light bulb went on and I thought, wow, we're big time now, or this is really a cool airport, I have to believe it would be the opening of the new terminal. Having grown up in the little tiny blue one, which was at the time very cool, I'm sure in the 50s, once we got the big new terminal building, I think everybody decided we're on the map. And in that same regard, with the the new terminal building, which is the one we're in.
Start that again within that same regard.
In that same regard, I remember kind of a cute story in this current terminal building before the last expansion. But when it first opened, Dad called us and said, come on, we're going to go out and see something really cool at the airport. So we all got in the car and came to the new terminal, and we went to the Delta counter, and they took us down to the Delta desk, and we got to see the very first skywalk. What are they called, guys? The gates, the rolling gates, the expandable gates. I've lost the name of it. But you would have thought that we had a Ferrari or something. I mean, everybody in the airport was sort of gaga over the thing, and we got to ride on it. They took us on it like it was a toy. We walked down to the end, and they make it go up and down and drive it back and forth and all this, which you could never do these days, you know. But I remember that Daddy, and at that time, I believe the airport manager was Mr. Bro, James Bro. They were so proud of that thing. So it's kind of that opening of this current building that I think everybody thought we were pretty big time, relatively speaking.
That's great.
Tell us about when the University of Kentucky Wildcats won the NCAA Championship.
I do specifically recall the 1978 championship season when the Wildcats came home. Clearly an unexpected moment in airport history, and one that has not been repeated. I'm sure everyone learned a lot from it, but when the team came in, they were met by thousands of fans who just descended upon this building, and it was a sea of humanity. If you looked across the whole inside of the airport. Now, I have to say that I was not allowed to come out that evening, but Daddy got a quick call and he raced over here. We did see the photographs in the paper, and I did come out the next day, so I saw the aftermath. But there were people hanging off of the banisters of the second floor stairwell. They had somehow hopped from that to this flat landing area, and we're hanging there with our legs hanging out, go Big Blue and all this. And to the extent that I recall, a portion of a false ceiling that people were on actually, I believe, did cave in. And I've lost the name, do not let him know this, but the wonderful gentleman that sits up front in the admin offices can tell you all about it because he was here. But yeah, that was quite a momentous occasion.
Talk about Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth's visit.
Quite exciting, quite exciting. And there was a lot of advanced planning. This is not something that she does all the time. And it was the first visit. After they got the first visit under their belt, things became much smoother, but I know that she had quite an advanced team. There was a protocol as to who exactly would be able to greet her, and that ended up being Mr. and Mrs. Bro and my father and mother. There was also a protocol as to someone to offer her flowers. A child was allowed to offer her flowers, and it had to be a child of certain age or under, impeccably dressed. And when I do recall when the first child came out, there was a couple of people that weren't sure that she was impeccably dressed enough. But she looked darling. I remember I was so jealous. I thought I'd like to do that. But she was not here at the airport long. Briefly said hello to everyone and was whisked off to Lanes Inn. I will say that as an adjunct story, my parents found out that typically the Royal Air Force pilots that fly her sit in a hotel until she's finished, twiddling their thumbs. Well, Mother and Dad decided they were going to entertain the Air Force pilots that flew her over. And so for each of her visits, we had sort of a Kentucky barbecue at our home with all Kentucky foods and lots of fun people that they would be interested, mostly pilots, local pilots. And they had a great time being entertained. Mom and Dad corresponded with them, visited them when they went over to England. And I do know that the first crew had such fun that they told the second crew that they should hopefully have that same party. So there was a lot of goodwill, extended Kentucky hospitality.
Any recollection of U.S. presidents visiting the airports?
My recollection of presidents visiting the airport is sort of sketchy. I do know that both Presidents Bush have been here, and beyond that, I really don't have a good feel for presidents. I really don't. And I really believe the Bushes were here more on social visits than on political visits. As far as when the presidents have visited, here again, it's from an aviation bent that I have my recollection. We were just excited that Air Force One was going to be here, which had never happened. And that is also an additional photograph that Dad has. And that was, I do know, for both Presidents Bush, like I said. But other than that, that's about it for the presidents, really.
Talk about the events related to the new terminal opening.
Yes, and as far as the openings of the new terminal, I do recall there was a big ribbon cutting, and actually before that we should back up and say that there was a big, what is the term? Groundbreaking. They had a big groundbreaking ceremony, made plaques out of the shovels. We have lots of photographs of that type of thing because it was huge. It was really, really a huge event. So yes, there was plenty of that going on as far as the new terminal is concerned.
What do you remember about the demolition of the old terminal?
Oh, we were around. It would be like, I recall when the old terminal was torn down, because the old terminal stayed up. It was not raised so that this building could be built. Any photos you see, it was basically over there close to the Alpha Taxiway, I think. And if you've ever lived in an old home and had to see it torn down or move, whatever, it was definitely a bittersweet moment. And the contrast of seeing that old, pretty shabby, crumbling terminal next to this new, sleek thing, it was striking, definitely striking. And my father, I remember flying with him, and Mother too, because I think he made Mother fly while he took the pictures. That was always an argument in the airplane, who was doing the flying and who was taking the pictures. But to this day, Daddy has a framed picture of both of the terminals before they raised the old one. It's very striking.
Do you recall any parallel runways discussions?
Oh, for heaven's sake, the parallel runway discussions, that was the parallel runways or the lengthening of the runways, any growing pains that the airport has always been a very uncomfortable issue, just because of were in the middle of the horse farms. And I do recall that. That was one issue that lasted for years and years. And I know that it was difficult for my father. He was chairman at the time when all this started. He received a lot of flack from the area horse farm people, people, the land conservators, and you know, my father was raised on a farm. He understood agriculture, but here he was, the commander of chairman of the board of a place that had growing pains, big time. So it was always difficult for him to balance the needs of the safety and logistics of the airport with wanting to save the green space. It was just pervasive for the last several decades, as it is now. So I think they've come to some wonderful compromises lately on it.
Tell us about any special events you recall.
The entrance and exit of various airlines here at the airport, whether they were joining the airport new or perhaps shuttered for a variety of reasons, it is another ongoing thing that was always big news if some airline came in. Off the top of my head, I can't recall any specifics. I do know that there was big celebration when we would have a new airline coming in. But off the top of my head, I just can't remember any names that, we watched Allegheny and Piedmont, the oldies that were here, be swallowed up, bought out, what have you, by the other Uniteds, whatever. Anytime we would get a nationally known air carrier, it was just yet another feather in the cap. We're big stuff, but nothing else specific, really.
Any changes in the airport terminal over the years?
I know that even this terminal that we're talking about now, the existing terminal, has experienced several changes since it was built. I think the expansion has been quite remarkable, and it just is yet another feather in the cap to say we're continuing to grow. As Lexington grows, so does the airport, or so should the airport, in order to adequately serve the population.
Talk about your family's involvement in aviation.
As far as our family's involvement in aviation is concerned, clearly it started with my father way back when, as a country boy in Madison County, and then through med school and the like. My mother was an accomplished pilot, and she became a pilot after marrying my father. She had interest in aviation because prior to that, and prior to her marriage to Dad, she was an airline hostess, which was then known, which was the terminology for stewardess, which now is your flight attendant. But she worked for several years for Capital Airlines, which is the precursor of United Airlines, based out of Arlington or Washington, D.C. So she was sort of smitten with airlines and flying at that time. So it wasn't too long after they got married that she did get her license. And my brother, who is also a pilot, we just grew up in it. It was, I feel so fortunate because it's sort of unusual. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. We got to travel a lot of places in our own little plane, which I need to make sure everyone knows that it was not fancy. If you put your arms out, you could probably hit both sides of it. It's about the interior volume of a Chevy Cavalier or something really tiny. But yeah, Mother was an enthusiastic pilot. She had she's had a couple of her own little planes, and She was a charter member of the local chapter of the 99s, which is an international organization of women pilots. And beyond the actual flying, our whole family, but chiefly Dad and Mom, have been very passionate about aviation history, which started the Aviation History Roundtable, which was the precursor of our Aviation Museum of Kentucky, which is here on the grounds.
When did you learn to fly?
I had my very first lesson given to me by a local pilot by the name of Omer Broadus, who was a character and a half and a very military, by the numbers, scary to death kind of guy, but he was a family friend, loved him. I was 14, and it was a cross-country flight from Louisville to Lexington. And I didn't start taking lessons seriously and consistently until I was about 17. And due to other distractions as a teenager, didn't quite, I got my license in the early 80s, my private license, and got it right here at Aerotech. Was well prepared by Arlen and Charlie over there and some of their pilots. My brother is also a pilot. He is a single engine pilot. He's not current, as we say. He'd probably need to have a flight review to get back up in the skies, but his interest is really more in airline history. So he's quite into that.
Talk about your father's role in founding the Aviation Museum of Kentucky.
My father's role in the creation of the Aviation Museum actually started with his co-founding of the Kentucky Aviation History Roundtable. His co-founder was Wendell Murphy, and Wendell and Dad were best of friends. They loved hanging out here at the airport, chit-chatting and what we call hangar flying. And the more they got to talking and more they got to talking with some of their friends, they determined that there would probably be a group that would be interested in meeting quarterly, however long, to talk about aviation history and specifically how Kentuckians had contributed to aviation history. So that started way back in the 70s off of this property. And that was really the start of the Aviation Museum. And after many, many years of very successful aviation roundtable meetings, the whole group decided to take it one step further and jump in and have a museum.
Tell us more about spending time at the airport when you were a child.
I have so many memories, like I said, of this place, just having grown up here, but there have been some funny ones, or memories that struck me as a child, which don't know how many people you've interviewed that have seen the evolution of the airport through the eyes of a young girl, but that was me. And I will tell you about the Concorde. That was not funny, but an amazing thing that to this day I still remember when the Concorde came in and landed. And it sat right out here on the tarmac, and everybody came over. This was pre-9/11. If you had a ramp pass, you could wander over and see the Concorde. You get to go up inside of it, take a tour. It's kind of cool. Several of us, the Gumberts and the Mosleys, we taxied our own little tiny planes over and put it in front of the Concorde, and we all stood out there and had our pictures made with the Concorde. But I remember Dad taking me out on the taxiway after the Concorde left, and the wingspan of the Concorde and its outboard engines were so powerful, and while we thought at the time we were just a cosmopolitan airport, the wings overlapped the edges of the runway, and when they threw the throttle forward on that Concorde and it went rolling, the thrust blew the airport runway lights out. I mean, glass, sticks, just whatever. And I'll never forget the aftermath of seeing that. We were all really impressed that it was that powerful. Clearly, there have been a number of modifications and remodels that I'm sure that would never happen, but I do remember that being sort of an interesting thing. And then as far as my recollections of the general aviation or private aviation aspect of the airport, it is very much like what, if you're familiar with the racetrack industry, it is very much like a backside or a backstretch. Yes, there were families that I remember growing up with. We did a lot, the Gumberts did a lot with Dr. and Mrs. Muldrow and their children, David Stevens, Dr. Stevens and their family. It wasn't too many nights that in the summer times when you could come out here. It was quiet. There weren't these rolling gates to get in and out of places. And there was always somebody working on their private airplane. And you'd stop by their little hangar. Once they did get the T hangars in, which is, that was a huge step for general aviation because we were all in a couple of the big hangars just sort of mashed in there. But that was one thing that Dad was very excited about was the building of the first T hangars. And when you have T hangars, that is sort of like cabins on the lake or whatnot, where you can just kind of go and visit your neighbors. And we did that.
Talk a little about when the 747s came in.
I will share with you a couple of public gatherings out here in a moment, but as far as my recollection of when the 747s first started coming to town, that created huge buzz. And even though the 747 that was coming in, and this included not only Sheikh Maktoum's 747, but also Air Force One, as in its 747 model. These were the short-bodied. These were not the long-bodied ones that you would typically see for passengers heading out of New York or Chicago. But given that, they were huge. And I remember there being a lot of discussion amongst the piloting set out here as to whether or not the runways were going to be long enough and how they were going to handle it. I do know that the first of the 747s landed and took off prior to our runway 422 extension. And in an old pilot term, Daddy would say, well, they had to back it up against the fence to get enough room to go on and take off. I think they were very careful. They had to take off out of here with low fuel and go to a much larger airport to refuel for their main trip because they didn't want the weight of the fuel. They were very careful as to temperature of day, not too hot. But yeah, there for a while, it was quite interesting to watch them. There's no doubt.
Talk about any public gatherings you recall at the airport.
One of the public gatherings that took place more than once that I think would be very significant were our air shows. Oh my gosh, we used to have, of course I was young, so I thought they were all cool, but we had some pretty nice little air shows for a place like this. We have had the Blue Angels here, and they have done some wonderful things, lots of aerobatics. The last air show that I'm aware, and David Trapp Jr. could speak to that, would be one that the Navy League hosted. But I always will remember the Blue Angels and then the Thunderbirds, the Air Force Thunderbirds, coming in, and they did some pretty darn low-level stuff out over the city, you know, coming shooting in at all angles to make a big production here at the airport. They were spectacular. and well publicized, well attended by Lexington and environs. I would say that if we had, besides the current come ride your bikes on the runway day or whatever they do have, which is a great idea, I would think the air shows were quite a draw for the community. I don't know when the air shows started. I would love to know that as well. I do know that in the 70s we had a few, and I have to believe that the last one was the one put on by the Navy League. And I would just have to think that liability and cost have a lot to do with that. So, but they were cool.
Tell us about your father's role in opening the fire training facility at Bluegrass Airport.
The support and improvement of the crash rescue part of this airport was always very important to my father. They started out with little or nothing. They started out with basically used equipment from fire departments that they pretty much were very resourceful. He felt like they needed equipment that was up to safety standards. He was very proud of the fire safety or crash rescue building that was built, I believe, in the late 70s. I might have to be corrected on that, but right there at the confluence of the two taxiways. And beyond that, he felt like they needed a place to train. If you go to, here in Lexington, the police have a training facility, the fire department has a training facility, and he felt like these men and women needed a place where they could really go through their paces. So that is why he was very enthusiastic about acquisition of the land down on Fort Springs, Pinkard area, the Givens property next to that, for a training facility.
Do you know how your father came to be on the airport board?
By the time I got to being old enough to know what was going on, I don't even recall who appointed him. It was not Pam Miller.
How did your family feel about having a road named after your father?
We're a normal family, and having the gesture of someone naming a road after you has been very flattering, not only for Dad, but for all of us. It's been somewhat amusing because I bet once a month I get a call from somebody that will be flying down Versailles Road and happen to look up and see that funny name Gumbert up there, Gumbert Road, and I'll get this call like, when did that happen? What's that all about? But I do know that it's been very flattering, and I know that Dad is very, very pleased with it.